Welcome to Communication Between Cultures, Chapter 10. Chapter 10 talks about applying much of the information that we have learned and the tactics that we have learned throughout this semester to the different settings in which we're more likely going to be able to need to use this information. We section Chapter 10 into three different sections. First of all, we're going to be talking about business and professional communication. Secondly, we'll be talking about communication in the healthcare. I'm sorry, in the educational setting. Next, we're going to be talking about intercultural communication in the healthcare setting. But for this section, we're going to be focusing on business. And when I talk about business, I'm not talking necessarily just about buying and selling type of business. Okay, so this isn't just for you business majors. This is for anybody who's planning to go into the professional world. So anytime you want to step out internationally in a professional capacity, this information is going to be important to you so that you know how to conduct yourself in that setting. So we're going to start out with a little bit of review, just some to remind ourselves of some things that are particularly important in this particular setting. First of all, let's remember that communication is governed by rules. Our cultures give us a set of rules for every particular situation. What can be said and what can't be said, when it can be said and and when it can't be said, and also how it can be said. What are the right types of behaviors in each situation? We will act differently according to our cultural rules depending upon the situation that we're in. So, for example, if you're going to be in a job interview, if you're going for a job interview, chances are you're going to dress differently, act differently, use different types of vocabulary than you would have with your friends at a pizza party or a movie theater. Remember, too, that we always also find rules in every culture regarding formality and informality. Some cultures are much more formal than others, and the level of formality varies between situations. And what is expected of your level of formality is going to vary depending upon the situation. Americans tend to be relatively informal in our speech and mannerisms, even in relatively formal types of situations. So even in the job setting, we tend to be much more informal than other cultures tend to be. We will dress more informally and we'll call each other by our first names. We'll even joke around and laugh and smile and maybe even slouch a little bit just to try and help others feel more at ease and to feel more at ease ourselves. But in contrast, the majority of other cultures will take formality much more seriously than we do. They have many strict rules governing that formality, the use of titles, how people should interact with one another, uh, rules regarding interpersonal relations, how you react to somebody or relate to somebody who is much older than you are, or perhaps maybe higher up in the status than you are within the company. Uh, these things are going to be very important to certain cultures, and we need to be able to understand that so that we don't overlook the importance of this when we are interacting with other cultures. Another important communication rule to remember is the difference between cultures when it comes to attitudes toward assertiveness. In some cultures, like our own and that of Germany and Israel, we value certain types of assertiveness, a way of distinguishing yourself, maybe a bit of competition between employees in order to see who is the better employee or who has the better ideas. This kind of aggressiveness, this kind of competition is considered to be a positive way of being able to distinguish yourself and to get yourself out there and help yourself to succeed. But in other kind of cultures, many other cultures that put more value on interpersonal harmony, such as Asian cultures or Latin American cultures, which also tend to be very collective cultures, right? They put more emphasis on interpersonal harmony even in the professional setting. So competition is not going to be considered to be a really very valuable tool because competition can actually cause disharmony within the group. So their focus is going to be more on group success rather than on individual success. And if it's going to be a matter of distinction, then it's going to be a matter of working together with your group to distinguish your group, maybe from another group or from another company. We also have differences in status relationships, and these are the differences between our high power distance cultures and our low power distance cultures. To equate that to the professional setting, we're going to be seeing in more low power distance cultures more of an egalitarian attitude, whereas while we have, as a matter of necessity, differences between the boss and the or boss and the lower subordinate workers, we're going to see, though, between them more of an attitude of informalness, of openness, an encouragement for superiors to interact as friends with their subordinates and to minimize the level of formality between the different status relationships. On the flip side of that, we have our high power distance cultures that have more of a hierarchical attitude, whereas the differences in status are considered to be not just necessary or organizational, but natural. And they may be determined by things such as your organizational status, but also such as the family you belong to, or your age, your level of education, or your occupation, so that people, even within the same status level, may have, or the same organizational status level, I should say, may have differences in status. So somebody may be a co-worker of yours, not necessarily a subordinate or a superior, but still be given deference because of their age or because of their experience. They have very strict rules that govern interactions between subordinates and superiors. That'll change the language that you use when you're speaking to them, perhaps the amount of deference that you give to them, and also the way that you express respect with those people. And you see this often in Asian and Latin American countries. Remember, too, that globalization has created an environment of international and intercultural independence, meaning that American corporations are present and active in hundreds of other countries. So, even if you are employed by an American corporation, there's a very good chance that at some point or another, if not at the time that you're employed, that corporation is going to be doing business in some other foreign country, and you may be required to interact with people in that country um, either as a seller trying to sell them something, their customers, or you may be working together and collaborating on a project. Remember, too, that many foreign businesses are present and active here in the United States. So even if you never leave our borders, you're still going to be working and dealing with country or companies that are coming from overseas. You may very well, very easily be employed by one of these companies. Here in Pittsburgh, we have many corporations that many of the largest employers here in Pittsburgh are foreign companies like Bayer, like Siemens, like Mitsubishi. So some of our biggest employers are all foreign countries, are foreign companies that we're going to, if you work for them, you may have to work with people from overseas. We also because of increased immigration, no matter where you work, even if you're working for a wholly American country or company that does only business here in the United States, there's a good chance that you're going to be working with people of other diverse backgrounds, people who come from other places and have other cultural ideologies. So being a multiculturally aware individual is going to be extremely important regardless of the professional situation that you find yourself in. All right, so that's pretty much it for our review. So we're going to start talking about certain things that are specific to certain things that we need to know that are specific to interacting in the business and professional arena. So, we're going to talk about different types of protocol in different cultures. And the first type of business protocol we're going to talk about is initial contacts. Different cultures have different expectations on what is the proper way to make that initial contact. Here in the United States, it's pretty acceptable for us to do something called the cold call, to just call somebody up and without an appointment and say, or go to somewhere without an appointment and say, hey, my name is Cheryl Ashbaugh. I just graduated from Robert Morris University with such and such degree. I'm looking for a position, and I really think that I could do good things for your corporation. I'd really like it if you give me an opportunity to talk to you about a position here. Or perhaps maybe if you're selling something, you call somebody up and say, I have a wonderful product that would be perfect for your particular endeavors, and I really would like the opportunity to talk to you about it. That is considered to be an acceptable way to make a first or initial contact with another corporation. But in other countries like Japan and Egypt and Africa, these kinds of uh, initial cold calls are probably going to stop your initiative right there in its tracks. They consider these kinds of aggressive behaviors as being very unsophisticated, as being very rude, as being just very uncouth, right? So they won't like that very much. They'll have a very nasty impression of you if you try to do that. Instead, they use professional go betweens. Um, they are more concerned about relationship building. So they're going to want to only do business with people with whom they have a prior relationship. Well, then you might say, well, how does anyone ever start a relationship? They try to use people that they have a mutual relationship, or somebody who has a relationship with somebody they have a relationship with, right? A mutual go between. So if I'm an A company and I want to do business with C company, and I don't know anybody in C company, but I know somebody in B company who does business with C company, I may talk to B company and ask B company if they will recommend me to C company, and in that way make the connection. If you don't have a mutual business associate, then you might use a professional go between, somebody whose job it is to actually be that go between. So you call the professional go between, you say, hey, I'm A company from the United States. I'd really like to talk to C company in Japan, but I don't know anybody that we don't have any mutual acquaintances. Can you help me out? And they'll take your information, maybe do some research on you, and then they'll contact C company and say, I've had this inquiry by A company in the United States. They check out, and I'd like to know if it would be okay for them to contact you. So you don't just contact C company directly. You're going to have to go through some kind of other professional go between. And this again is because of the importance of relationships in these cultures. The importance of relationships is not just a social thing, it's also a professional thing. So professional relationships are really important. Next, let's talk about greeting behaviors. In the United States, we're pretty relatively informal, as we've talked about before. Both men and women will shake hands upon meeting and upon leaving. All right, so we don't have any concerns about what gender you are. Both men and women will shake hands. First names are commonly used, except in very formal situations or maybe for a very first meeting. When we address people in senior positions, we'll often use a full name or a title, at least for the first time until we're told we can do differently. But um, even with people in senior positions, we often still use sometimes first names very commonly. Like, for example, if I were to address my superiors here at Robert Morris University, I would generally refer to them by their first name, and they would expect me to do so, and they would reciprocate that by using my first name. We will routinely exchange business cards here in the United States. So business cards are an important part of our professional interaction, but at the same time, we limit that to strictly business types of settings. In strictly social settings, we will not exchange business cards. That's considered to be overly aggressive and kind of uh, how should I say, kind of creepy. We just don't like that. We want to separate in some ways a strictly social setting from a strictly business setting. While we appreciate aggressiveness in the professional setting, we do not appreciate that same professional aggression in the social setting. In China, you want to make sure that you're always greeting the more senior person first. Again, we have a high power distance culture here, so hierarchy is extremely important. I have actually made this mistake myself in the past, not with Chinese, but with the Japanese, which have the same communication rule. I was meeting a group of people from the mayor's office of Saitama City. I'll talk about that here in a little bit later, but I didn't know, I hadn't done my cultural or hadn't done my homework ahead of time, and I didn't know what the mayor looked like. I was expecting that it would be obvious when I met these people that he would probably be significantly older, or they, might not be walking next to him or whatever, but I thought it would be obvious and it wasn't. And I accidentally greeted his secretary before I greeted the mayor. Fortunately, the mayor of Saitama City is a pretty fun and chill guy, so it wasn't a problem, but it could have been. And I needed to have done my homework first to know who I was meeting, what they looked like, and who was who. The use of titles is very prevalent, more prevalent than the use of names. So if you do not know somebody's name, that's okay. You can probably get by without knowing their name, but you cannot get by without knowing their title. You must know their titles. You must be able to address them by their titles. Um, if you like again, if you used only their title and not the name, that's okay. But if you only use their name and not their title, that will not be okay. Remember, when you do use names, that the order of Chinese names is often reversed from ours. That means that the family name comes first, followed by the given name. So if I were to say my name in Chinese, it would be Ashba Cheryl instead of Cheryl Ashba. So when you are presented with a Chinese person's name, you need to maybe do a little research to know, unless you're familiar with Chinese names, which is the first name and which is the last name. Because sometimes when they present their names to Americans, knowing that we put our given names first and our family names last, they'll present their names in the American style. Um, but sometimes they won't. So we need to do some pre-research to know ahead of time which is their given name and which is their family name. When you are greeting someone in China, bowing is the usual Chinese greeting. However, it's very common for a cross-cultural mix of a slight bow and a brief handshake. So that's going to be more likely the way that you will be greeted by your Chinese counterparts, with both a slight bow and a handshake. Also, we've talked about this before, but just to kind of reiterate, a nod of the head and is not an acknowledgement, or is an acknowledgement of the speaker, and is not necessarily an indication of agreement. It is very important to understand that in both Japanese and Chinese cultures. Otherwise, that can cause a great deal of confusion for you in your negotiation process. All right, in India, a common greeting is called the namaste. All right, in namaste, when you say namaste, you will put your hands together, slight bow with your hands pressed together near the chest, as if you're praying, as if you're a Christian saying your prayers. You put your hand in front of your chest. Those of you who are familiar with yoga, often this would be called in your yoga practice hands to heart center, right? But keep in mind, though, that this is only appropriate if you're interacting with Hindus. If the person that you're interacting with is not Hindu, which is very possible in India. So most of the people are Hindu, but there are an awful lot of people in other religions as well, including the Muslim religion. If you do not know what religion the person is that you're greeting, do not use namaste to greet them, because it could be insulting if they are not Hindu. So the best way is just to go the Western style. Take a handshake, say hello. That's an acceptable business greeting in India. Remember that they were occupied by the Brits for a very long time, and so they're very comfortable with the Western way of doing business. Remember to interpersonal distance rules. Interpersonal distance rules are very important in India because of their strict status differences, their strict social status differences. When you have when you are talking to someone who is your coworker or your equal, they're probably going to be closer to you when you're interacting. But as soon as you're speaking to somebody who is either your superior or your inferior in an organizational setting, that interpersonal distance is going to increase. So there is going to be a difference, and you need to be aware of how close you are to somebody when you're speaking to them, uh, depending upon the organizational relationship that you have with that person. All right, in Japan, like in China, bowing is an important part of the greeting. The Japanese will sometimes do the combined handshake with the slight bow, but many Japanese business persons tend to be a little bit more traditional in their business dealings than the Chinese, so they may actually not do that, but do a full formal bow. The technique of bowing in Japan is governed by a lot of different rules, right? And the rules govern or dictate who bows first, how low you bow, how long you bow, where to place your hands while bowing. For example, if you are addressing a superior, you're going to bow first and you're going to bow lower than if you are addressing someone who is your organizational equal or someone who is your subordinate. If you are a man and you're bowing, you're going to put your hands straight to the side and you will bow at the waist with your hands remaining at your side. If you are a woman, when you are bowing, you will start with your hands to the side of your thighs, and as you bow, your hands will come forward to the front of your thighs. So there are differences. Now, that said, foreigners are not commonly expected to know the nuances of bowing, so you don't have to freak out too much about that. A respectful, slight bow is going to be appropriate in most cases. However, you want to be mindful of the actions of the person that you are meeting. If that person gives you a deeper bow, then you want to make sure that you are employing an equal bow, particularly if this person is your equal or your superior. Because not to employ an equally deep bow would be very arrogant and very rude, and they would take that they take offense to that. So basically, just before you lean forward and put your hand out there, follow the lead of your Japanese counterpart and see what they're going to be doing. Because again, many Japanese who are more accustomed to working with foreigners will probably just go right for the handshake and might not even do the bow, or they'll do the combination bow and handshake. But there are many Japanese yet who will still only do the bow. So you want to follow through with that and see what they do, and just kind of follow their lead on that one. Japan has some very strict protocols in how you greet formally or how you greet verbally as well. For example, if you're going to be meeting someone for the very first time, you're going to be greeting them, introducing yourself differently than if you were meeting them for any subsequent time. So the first time that you meet anyone, you're going to state who you are, but you're also going to say something very specific, um, and it'll sound like this: "Watashi wa Ashpashara desu. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu." And if you break it down, it makes it very much sense in their particular culture. It says, Watashi wa Ashpa Shero desu, just means my name is Shero Ashpa. Yoroshiku anishimasu means please take care of me or treat me well. Okay, so that makes sense when you think about their emphasis on interpersonal harmony and collective face saving. So it goes right into that kind of mindset. But even in a somewhat less formal setting, you're still going to say this when you meet somebody for the first time. And yes, frankly, foreigners aren't necessarily going to need to know that or be expected to know that. But I have had people, Japanese people, come to me and say this to me, not thinking because that's just so much a part of their culture that they would do it. And then I was able to respond back to what they said in Japanese, and I'd say it scored me a lot of brownie points. So you want to make sure that you can do this. Now, I don't speak Japanese, all right, but I have been able to learn certain words and phrases that can help me out. And anybody is capable of doing this. You don't need to understand the language completely and enable or to be able to understand these types of verbal greeting protocols and be part of them. Also, remember the time of day is very important, and it's going to change how you greet somebody. In the morning until about 10 a.m., you're going to say "Ohayo gozaimasu," and again, that is a little bit more formal. If you're speaking to a friend or a coworker or somebody that you have a less formal relationship, you'll just say "Ohayo." Uh, but if you're speaking to somebody that's more formal, like in a business type of situation that you maybe haven't met before, you'll say "Ohayo gozaimasu." All right. So, but after 10 a.m., between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., you're going to say "Konnichiwa." Now, "Konnichiwa" is common in both formal and informal settings. Um, After 6 p.m., however, you're going to say "Konbanwa," and that's a little bit more formal than konnichiwa, but in the business and professional setting, I'd say it's probably always appropriate to go with konbanwa. So remember, when depending on what time of day you're meeting with somebody, you're going to have a different greeting as well. The exchange of business cards is extremely important in Japan. The business card is seen as the extension of the individual. So, by treating the business card with respect, according to their traditions and their expectations, you are treating that individual with respect. So business cards should be printed with English on one side and Japanese on the other. So anytime that, and this is true with a lot of different places, in fact, almost any place that's not traditionally English speaking, you should have a dual-sided business card. One done in the language of the country that you are working with, and one done in English. When you are giving or receiving a card in Japan, you want to use both hands and present the card face up toward the receiver. So you're going to hold the business card in two hands in such a way that they can see the face of the business card, right? So you're going to put your thumbs on the corners and present it to them with two hands. And often a slight bow will go along with that as well. Um, when you receive the card, you're going to receive it in the same way. You're going to take it with two hands. You're going to look at it. You're going to pay attention to it. You're not just going to stuff it in your shirt pocket or, God forbid, in your back pocket. Okay. You're going to take a look at it. You're going to maybe comment on it. Oh, that's a beautiful picture of a bonsai. Why is that important to you? For example, the first time I met the mayor of Japan, or the mayor of Saitama City in Japan, he had a card that had a beautiful bonsai on it. Now, I know from previous experience that bonsai is very important to Saitama. They've got a beautiful bonsai garden. But I knew that if he had that on there, that was something that was important to him. So I asked him, say, "Oh, that's a beautiful bonsai." And he was able to come back then with, "Yes, this is very important to our city." And it was just a wonderful way to start a conversation and show him that I had that interest or in him and in his card as well. So you want to try and comment on the card if you can. And then when you put it away, again, don't just shove it in your pocket, all right? Because remember, this is an extension of the individual. So you want to treat it with respect. Have a little business card holder, a metal business card holder or a leather business card holder, whatever you prefer, but have a separate business card holder that you can open that up and you can put the business card in the holder and then try to put it in a purse or a bag or maybe a folder if you've got something, a briefcase or something. Don't just shove it in your pocket. And if you do need to put it in a pocket, make sure you're putting it in a front pocket or maybe a jacket pocket or something, but never put it in your pants pocket like you would some guys with your wallets, right? Because if you go and put something in your wallet and then you put your wallet in your back pocket and then you sit on it, it's like the equivalent of sitting on that individual. So that's extremely offensive. You don't want to definitely don't want to do that, which we might do here in the United States, right? We might take a card, put it in our wallet, stick the wallet back in the back pocket, and then just go about our day and whatever we do with that wallet and sitting down on that person, okay, or on that person's business card. That would be extremely insulting to the Japanese. You don't want to do that. All right, in Arab cultures, we will again have greetings involving numerous handshakes. If you know somebody a little bit better, maybe not for your first initial professional greeting, but once you get to know somebody a little bit better, you may have more kind of an embrace, even a kiss on both cheeks between members of the same sex. And that's important. Cross gender touching is very taboo. So you will never see men and women shaking hands or kissing on the cheek or anything like that. When you are addressing somebody who is of the opposite gender in an Arab culture, you're simply going to nod your head, possibly give a slight bow, and verbally greet that person. You do not put your hand out for a handshake because they either won't do it or they'll do it but feel uncomfortable with it. Now, that may be different for Arabs who are accustomed to dealing with Americans, maybe those who have been here for a while, or if they're over here and they're accustomed to that, they may feel perfectly comfortable with that handshake. But until they offer, you don't want to do it, just in case. Like in the United States and in Japan, business cards are routinely exchanged, and they should be in both Arabic and English. Titles are extremely important. They're always used in the business context, so you want to make sure that you know a person's title. Names are also important in this culture, so you want to try and know both the titles and the names. Keep in mind, too, when you're shaking hands with a Muslim, you always want to use your right hand. In the Islamic religion, the left hand is considered to be unclean, and therefore, shaking with the left hand is is considered to be a cultural taboo. You want to always shake with your right hand. Now, many people say, well, what if I'm left-handed? Well, even if you're left-handed, you can still make the effort to shake with your right hand. You're not hopefully that weak on your right side that you can't do that. But if you do have to like eat or write with your left hand, you can certainly do that. You might want to just explain to the group that you're left-handed and that's going to be perfectly fine. They won't think anything more of it beyond that. All right. In Mexico, the usual greeting and parting generally involves a handshake. It's not uncommon to have hugs and kisses, just like in the Arab cultures. The difference between the Mexican culture and the Arab cultures is that we don't have the cross-gender taboo issue. So we may see that kind of a greeting even among both genders, or between both genders. And again, this is probably not going to be something you're going to see in the business and professional situation, at least not for the first meeting, but possibly later on in a secondary meeting. If you have built that rapport, you may find this to be common. In Mexico, titles are very important. It is a high power distance culture. You want to make sure that you know the titles of the people that you're dealing with and that you use them appropriately. Using titles inappropriately in the business setting is going to help you to either gain or lose respect of your associates. All right, the next type of a business protocol we're going to talk about is personal appearance. Every culture has rules as to what makes a good personal appearance in a professional setting. What is expected? You want to make certain that you're falling within the rules of the culture that you're dealing with in order to gain their respect. Um, you want to make sure that you're dressed appropriately when it comes to the level of formality. You want to make sure that you're dressed appropriately when it comes to their concepts of modesty. You want to make sure that your accessories are not too gaudy or not gaudy enough, right? You want to make sure that you are dressing in such a way that you're going to elicit respect from your business counterparts. And you therefore you need to know what your counterparts are going to be expecting and how they're going to interpret the clothes that you wear and the accessories that you put on. If you do not know what is appropriate in that particular culture, or not even in just that culture, but in a particular setting within that culture. Say you're going to go to a particular culture and you're going to go to a business meeting. After the business meeting, you're going to go out with friends, or you're going to be going out with coworkers. What you wear to the business meeting may not be the same thing that you're going to wear when you go out. So, and if you're not sure what is appropriate, then ask. All right? It's not going to make you look bad to ask a question about, I'm not sure. Say, just simply say, I'm not sure what's appropriate. What should I wear? Can you give me an idea? And that is actually going to make them feel more comfortable. It's going to make you feel more comfortable than if you were to show up dressed in the wrong type of attire, either too formal or too informal. So just ask, and it doesn't take a super close relationship to be able to say that and have them appreciate the fact that you are cognizant of the fact that maybe things are done differently there than where you come from, and that you want to do it the right way. Keep in mind that if you're a woman doing business in a Muslim country, what is considered to be modest clothing in the United States is not necessarily considered to be modest in those countries. You want to make sure that you're wearing a higher neckline. You want to make sure that if you're going to wear a skirt, that it extends well below the knees. It may be better for you to just wear looser slacks. Um, just keep that in mind. You may need to cover your head. Um, and you may not. It depends upon the country that you're going to. But do your work or do your research ahead of time to know what is appropriate. That's not to say that you have to dress in their traditional clothing for women. That's not actually that's not expected, and it's not even a particularly good rule of thumb unless you're asked to do so. Uh, but to just simply wear your regular Western clothing, but a very much more modified or modest version of it. Gift giving is extremely common in many cultures, and it seems very odd to us because it's actually something that is highly taboo in our culture to give gifts in a professional or a business type of situation. We equate it to bribery, and unless we're talking about little gifts like mouse pads or pens or something like that, it's generally considered to be completely inappropriate. But in other cultures, it is not only appropriate, it's expected. And you need to know when you're going to be expected to give a gift, if you're going to be expected to give a gift, and what kinds of gift are appropriate in that particular culture. Every culture has different rules as to what kinds of gifts are appropriate, what colors of gifts are appropriate. Some cultures have taboos against even or odd numbers of of gifts, right? So if you have an odd number of something in a package, that may be either considered lucky or unlucky depending upon your culture. Clocks are a bad idea to give in Asian countries, particularly in Japan, because it's said that that is a reminder of the passing of time. Knives are a bad idea in Japan because that shows the severing of a tie. Um, Certain types of flowers can be wonderful gifts in certain for certain settings, but you have to know what kinds of flowers are acceptable, what number of flowers, equal or odd number of flowers you should be giving. So there are a lot of nuances each culture has as to what kind of gift is appropriate. What kind of gifts that are appropriate in a professional setting may be different than the kinds of gifts that are appropriate in a social setting, but gifts are still considered to be expected for each type of setting. Um, I want to show you a picture here. This picture is of when the mayor of Saitama City and the city council came in 2013. I like this picture, so I use it, even though it's not their most recent visit. They most recently just came again last year. They come every 7 years to re-sign the Sister City Agreement. And but this is a really good example for this particular gift giving idea. In Japan, gift giving is extremely important. Um, they will have gifts on just about every formal occasion, and it's usually given at the beginning of the communication. So you want to make sure that you have your gift right away. Here you see uh, the mayor and the council chairman holding two plaques from Wendell August Forge that were given to them by our mayor and city council. And you see that our councilman and our councilwoman and our mayor are having two dolls, well, a very expensive Japanese doll here, and a fan, as well as the little cute little dragon plushie that is the mascot of Saitama City. And they gave those were gifts that were given to our mayor and city council, and then our mayor and city council had to have gifts also to give in return. Now, unfortunately, in this particular visit, our mayor and our city council had not done their research ahead of time. They did not know that they needed to have gifts or that they were going to be receiving gifts. They had not done that cultural homework. Fortunately, they have my group. I am the president of the Pittsburgh Saitama City Sister City Association. And so we saved their butts by buying those plaques from Wendell August Forge. We basically handed them to them and said, here, give it to them. All right. So fortunately, though, they learned from that experience. We were able to help them save face, but they learned from that experience. And this year we didn't have to do that. They already had gifts ready and ready for them when the mayor and city council came to visit the mayor of Mayor Peduto this year or this last year. So you want to make sure that you have done your research ahead of time and you don't get stuck with receiving a gift when you have no gift to give, because that's going to look very bad uh, for you. It's going to make you look bad. You want to make sure that you've done that, you know what's appropriate, and that you have an appropriate gift available. All right, we have to remember, as we said, talked about before, that there are rules for conversation, right? Conversation is a rule governed thing, and therefore we have certain taboos when it comes to professional or conversation in the professional setting. Some topics of conversation that are acceptable here in the United States are not going to be acceptable in other cultures. For example, Americans commonly ask personal questions, just general personal questions to kind of break the ice. And before you start maybe talking, getting down to business or something, you're going to say, oh, maybe talk about your favorite sports teams, or whether or not you have kids, what your hobbies are, what you like to do with your free time. And that's perfectly fine. It works well here in the United States. But when you start talking to somebody who's from a culture that's more collective and they feel like they are there as a representative of their corporation and rather than as an individual, you start asking them general personal questions about them as an individual, that can make them feel very uncomfortable. Now, that's not to say that they don't like to have a little bit of small talk before getting down to business, but that small talk is going to be different types of topics of conversation, whether it be something that's going on around town or perhaps maybe information, asking them questions about their company or even about the weather. But you definitely don't want to necessarily just start in on those personal questions. Now, that's not to say that in those same cultures you can't ask personal questions in the social setting. So you can't just assume that just because asking personal questions isn't appropriate in the professional setting, that it isn't that it's also going to be inappropriate in the social setting. In the social setting, it may be perfectly fine. Also, make sure that you are avoiding controversial topics like politics and sensitive social issues in the business setting. While you may want to avoid uh, personal questions, you may also want to avoid these types of topics. Again, it's probably not going to be very conducive to business your business relationship to start asking them maybe asking a culture or somebody from a culture about their political problems or maybe even say, hey, I hear you have a large human trafficking issue here in this country. That's probably not going to be a great way to break the ice and start a friendship. Just try to avoid those types of things. Now, that's again not to say that once you have created a social rapport with an individual, that you can't, and you know that you can talk about that sort of thing without causing offense, that you can't talk to them about something like that in that situation. But in the more formal professional setting, it's really never going to be appropriate. Be careful what you say when you're trying to use humor. All right, not what is funny in one culture doesn't always translate as funny into another culture. Make sure that that's not to say that you always have to be serious and you can't possibly ever use humor. You just want to make sure that you know the culture very well, that you can use humor in a way that's going to be understood and appreciated, but also that perhaps you have a little bit of a rapport or more of a relationship built, that if you do make a mistake when it comes to humor, it's not going to be a killer. It'll be okay. In fact, the mistake might be more humorous than the statement that you were trying to make in the first place. But you want to wait until you are more comfortable with your relationships before you step into that arena. Management. Now, I've had you this week watch a video called Going International Managing the Overseas Assignment. And in that particular video, this area of protocol, the intercultural management styles, the differing intercultural management styles are talked about in a very effective way and illustrated very well. Uh, Between different cultures, management techniques are going to vary. In order to be an effective manager, you're going to want to make sure you understand what the management techniques are in that particular culture. You can't just take the tools that you learn to be an effective manager here in the United States and expect that they're going to work everywhere. And you see that demonstrated repeatedly in that video. For example, in the United States, as a manager, you're taught that individual achievements and initiatives should be rewarded. And we saw this attempted in the video when the American manager tries to reward uh, the one of the Japanese members with a promotion, but that didn't work out because in Japan they more concerned for interpersonal harmony and seniority, and that person, while I'm sure he appreciated that the manager liked what he was doing, it ended up hurting the whole situation because it wasn't an appropriate time for him to be rewarded. Instead, in cultures like Japan, that are more group oriented, individual attention is going to be more avoided. Instead of rewarding the individual, you're going to reward the uh, you're going to reward the group. So oftentimes we might have even if a certain individual within a group did something really terrific, okay, we're going to maybe treat the entire department to a corporate retreat or to a bonus of some sort. Not just that particular individual, but the whole department will get recognized. Now, that said, we know, and the people in the department know, who within their group is most responsible for that particular achievement. And you can be sure that the people within that group are going to give the person who made that achievement their just reward, right? And they're going to be grateful and they're going to let that person know what a great job they did. But you as the manager, that's not your role. Your role is to recognize the group rather than the individual. In China and Korea, again, we have this concept of group harmony, and that's very important. So you want to remember that in these cultures as well. Must also remember that corporate hierarchy and seniority are very, very strict. You must respect these high power distance concepts. You cannot just be informal with somebody who is either above you or below you. You have a very specific way that you need to interact with those people, and you don't want to break that protocol. If you delegate decision making to somebody who is your subordinate, that is actually going to backfire on you. In the United States, doing that is actually a good management technique that gives that person a little bit of ownership of the task at hand. Maybe makes them feel a little bit proud of their accomplishments so that they will accomplish more. But in many other cultures, that will backfire on you. And we see this illustrated really well again in the video. But in this situation, we see it illustrated in India, where the manager, American manager, attempts to delegate decision making to a subordinate. And instead, the subordinate thinks that because the manager is delegating that responsibility, the manager is immature and incapable of doing his job. And that delegation says to the lower level manager or the subordinate that my manager or my superior can't do his job or his or her job, that they don't belong in that situation. Therefore, why should I do anything that they say or ask me to do? So instead of taking responsibility and taking ownership of the task, they're probably actually going to back off of that task and not do it as well. In Mexico, like in the Asian countries, we see a high power distance culture. Subordinates are not to question the decisions of the boss. Bosses are expected to be aloof and inaccessible. Now, that does not mean that as a manager you're supposed to be rude to your subordinates. You want to respect your subordinates, but if you try too hard to fit in and kind of be their buddy or their friend, or maybe go out for lunch with them, or go for a cup of coffee with them, or have dinner with them, that's going to be considered to be inappropriate, and they are going to actually lose respect for you as opposed to gain respect for you. And that's just the opposite of what we do here in the United States, right? We often have team dinners where our managers will join us for dinner and we get to sit down and kind of chat with them. I know that when my manager calls me for our monthly meeting, that he likes to spend the first half of the meeting just chatting about what's going on in our lives instead of talking about things that are more job related. And to him, that's his way of kind of connecting with you and making you feel like you're part of his team. And that's very effective here in the United States, but will actually work against you in a more high power distance culture like Mexico. Decision making styles. Corporations make decisions differently from one culture to the next. And we've talked about this somewhat and how, and we're going to talk about this more also in the next section of this chapter when it comes to how individuals make decisions and how individuals learn. But in this case, we're talking about corporations. So to be effective, you need to understand how corporations make decisions. In some countries, like the United States and Arab countries, decision making is a very top down process. Does not involve a great deal of input from subordinates. People at the top make decisions and then send those decisions down to the lower levels for implementation. In other cultures, however, such as Japan, they have a more collective approach to decision making, which involves the initiation of ideas from any level, and then before the high or the people at the top make a decision, they are wanting to get input from every level. Let me go to the next slide here. And here I have a little bit of a visual for exactly just that, so you can see how a little bit visually how these two types of decision making styles differ. So here again, you see in the top-down process, decisions are made up at the top. So the leaders are going to make the decision. Now the pro to that is that decisions are made very quickly, right? So the top people will make the decisions without the input of the lower levels, and therefore you have fewer people weighing in on that decision. That decision will be made faster. But then they send their decision down to the lower levels, who are then tasked with the implementation of the decision. And it's going to be up to the lower levels then to try to figure out any unforeseen difficulties or problems that the people at the top didn't notice or didn't consider when making that decision. So therefore, implementation takes a very long time. On the flip side of that, we have the bottom up decision making style where decisions are made or can be made or can be initiated from the top, but or any level for that matter. And decisions can be initiated or ideas can be initiated from any level. But even if they're initiated from the top, before the top makes any decisions on anything, they're going to send that down to the bottom level. And that bottom level is going to do their research, put their have meetings, put in their input, try to figure out what all the possible nuances of problems could possibly be, what would be the answers to those problems, and then they're going to take that set of research and they're going to set it up to the next level who's going to do the same thing. Everyone's going to have their fingers in that bowl. They're going to have a way of inputting their thoughts into that process. And then the decision is finally going to be made by the people at the top. So the people at the bottom do not make the decisions. They're not the decision makers, but they do weigh in on that decision. And then once the people at the top have all the information from the lower levels, that's when they're going to make that decision. Now the downside to this method is that decision making takes a very long time because you're letting every level weigh in on it. But the plus side to that is that by having each level use their different style or their different expertises and weighing in on that decision, by the time the decision is made, all the possible problems have generally been worked out. They know whether or not this is a good decision, whether it's a bad decision, what could possibly go wrong, and have already figured out potential fixes for those things that could potentially go wrong. And based upon that information, that's when the top makes their decision. So while decision making tends to take a very long time, implementation goes much faster because all the unforeseen difficulties have they're not unforeseen, right? They've already been figured out and anticipated. And this is actually not uncommon in what you might see in an uncertainty avoidance culture or high uncertainty avoidance culture. So a top-down decision-making style is very common in a low uncertainty avoidance culture because the decision can be made quickly, but we don't really care what's going to happen. We'll figure it out as we go along. Whereas in the bottom-up version with a high uncertainty avoidance culture, we're not going to make any decisions unless we have a pretty good idea of what could happen and what we're going to do about it if it does happen. All right, next we're going to talk about negotiation. The processes and expectations of business negotiations are governed by cultural rules. So negotiations are going to be different in each culture. And if you're going to negotiate with somebody from another culture, you're going to need to understand their methods of negotiation so that you can counter their methods of negotiation in an effective way. And the first thing to be concerned with when you are going to go into a negotiation is who you're going to send to have do that negotiation. You have to remember the differences in the importance of hierarchy and importance of status when you're choosing your negotiators. If you send only low ranking employees to meet with people who are of higher rank, then that's going to signal to your partner corporation that you don't consider this negotiation, or you don't consider this particular corporate involvement to be important. Therefore, they're probably not going to consider it to be important either, and your negotiation is going to fail. Age is also a consideration. If you send somebody who is older, more experienced, into a culture that values age and experience, they're going to see that person as more valuable in the negotiation at the negotiation table. Even if, frankly, if you have, say, a person who is pretty young, but really a dynamite, okay, really an amazing individual, and you want to send that person to the negotiation table because you just know they're really good. If you're going to be sending them to the negotiation, you need to make sure that you're sending them with an older mouthpiece, because they are no matter how good they are, they're simply not going to be given the same respect as somebody who is older and more experienced. So that is something you definitely need to consider. Age is going to be more important to some cultures than necessarily ability. Gender is also a consideration when dealing with some cultures in which gender roles are very specific. And in some more conservative Arabic cultures, women are not largely seen in the business and professional setting, and that's changing very much. In fact, I, I may not even be able to say that in another decade or so, but it's still you're still going to see that in some corporations and in some cities. So you want to make sure that you know what you're getting into when you send over negotiators from a particular gender. If you're sending people to do negotiation in a very conservative Arab country, you may want to send your male negotiators rather than your female negotiators. If you do want to send a female negotiator, that's perfectly fine. Just make sure that she's well aware of what she's going to receive there, well aware of the cultural nuances there, so that she can be prepared to to, uh, to address those concerns appropriately, so that she can elicit the most amount of respect that she can. Also, we have to remember about business ethics and negotiations. What may appear unethical to one culture may be perfectly acceptable to another, and oftentimes when we're talking about this, we're talking about bribery. All right. Well, and gift giving as well. We just talked about how in the United States, gift giving is often considered to be inappropriate because we consider it to be a form of bribery, whereas in other cultures, it's perfectly fine. Actual bribery, not just ritual gift giving, but actual bribery is perfectly normal in some cultures and is expected in some cultures. Whereas in other cultures like our own, it is considered to be extremely inappropriate. Now, you cannot take your business ethics and then go and try to oppose them upon another country, right? So, if you're wanting to do business in a country in which bribery of government officials or of the police or whatever is a normal part of their business practices, you can't just go there and say, no, I'm not going to do it, and then still expect to be able to be successful in business there. You have to either try to come up with some kind of compromise, like maybe instead of giving money as a bribery, you could give favors like maybe a trip somewhere or a very nice dinner or something that maybe you feel more comfortable with but would also do the trick. Or you may simply have to say, nope, I can't do it. This is not a country in which I feel that I can ethically perform whatever business aspect that I need to perform, and simply say, this is probably not going to work for me, and then look elsewhere. But you can't just go somewhere and say that your ethics are going to rule the roost and expect to succeed in that culture. All right. Again, when we're dealing with communication and negotiation, we have to remember formality and status as always. How you're going to be interacting with the people you're going to be interacting with, depending upon who you're negotiating with. Are you negotiating with people who are your hierarchical equals? Somebody who is a subordinate to you, or somebody who is superior to you? How you do your negotiation and how you present your information is going to be very different depending upon your different roles and status. Also, remember that there are differences between the pace in which people do things in different cultures. Some cultures are anxious for decisions to be made very quickly so that implementation can be made very quickly. That is the top down decision making process. Whereas other cultures will want to take their time to make those decisions. Often, those are the the bottom up decision making cultures, and that can cause a great deal of tension when two different decision making styles butt heads. So if we go to a culture as a top down decision making culture, and we expect decisions to be made quickly, right? So then we go to a culture that takes their time to make decisions, and so we expect a quick decision, and instead they drag it out from one meeting to two meetings to three meetings to four meetings, and we hoped we would get a resolution in a week or two, and then now it's the second or third month and we still don't have a resolution. That can become very aggravating for us, and sometimes is often the reason that many business negotiations fail, because we get impatient with other cultures that tend to take more time. Now, what other cultures tend to take more time than we do to make decisions? Pretty much most of them, for a good many different reasons. Sometimes, it's because of high uncertainty avoidance. Sometimes it's because of different attitudes towards time, and how to approach decision making. But for whatever reason, most businesses or most cultures will take longer to make those decisions than we are accustomed to here in the United States. And they actually addressed that in that video as well. Emotional displays. Some cultures encourage different types of emotional displays in business negotiations, and others highly discourage it. So you're going to see as you do your research that some of the cultures that you are going to be researching for your group project are going to encourage a great deal of emotion in the business negotiation. Like the Russians, for example, they're going to put a great deal of emotion. They're going to maybe argue. They're maybe even slam the table. Okay, and that's not because they're angry, but that's just part of their business negotiation style. And you have to be prepared for that so that you can reciprocate and appropriately and not necessarily be intimidated by that. But at the same time, you do something like that in Japan and they're going to think you've lost your mind. All right, so you don't want to behave like that in Japan. You will never see somebody displaying emotion like that in Japan. I've heard many colleagues call the Japan the ultimate poker face. Right? You never know exactly what they're thinking in a business negotiation because they're going to look and express the same face whether they're extremely interested or whether they think your product or your proposal is complete garbage. It's going to be the exact same expression every time. It's they're always going to be polite, and but you really it's hard to get a feel for what they're thinking. They're never going to show that kind of emotional display, and if you do so, again, they're going to think you're nuts. So you want to make sure that you know what to expect and you know how to interpret. I mean, if even in the Japanese culture, if you know how to interpret their body language, you're going to be able to understand or get an idea of what they're thinking or what they're doing. But you have to have some real cultural knowledge to be able to make that interpretation. Uh, Most Americans generally do not know how to interpret that the nuances of those body languages. All right. When negotiating with a different culture, you must be mindful of that culture's attitude toward conflict and the importance of saving face, whether or not that culture is going to use direct or indirect language. Many cultures who put a great deal of emphasis on time management. Remember, we talked about monochronic versus polychronic time. Cultures that are more monochronic time oriented are going to put more emphasis on direct language, trying to make sure that everybody understands exactly what you're saying and that we can come to a conclusion quickly because everybody is on the same page. Some cultures are going to really put a great deal of emphasis on wanting to do exactly that, whereas other cultures are going to be more concerned with the collective face saving aspect of negotiation. They're not going to come right out and say, I think your product or your proposal is complete garbage. All right, because that's going to make you look bad, and they're not going to do that. They're simply going to be more indirect about it. They're not going to say one way or the other whether they like it. Instead, maybe they'll say, "Oh, we'll think about that," or "We'll have to take it under consideration." Meaning, actually, no way in hell am I ever going to buy this or work with you or whatever. Okay, but they're never going to say that. So you need to be able to understand how to interpret that kind of indirect language and be prepared for indirect language when normally at home you might expect people to be more direct and be able to take them at their word. Evidence and truth. Some cultures put a great deal of emphasis on facts and figures for their decision making. So when you go there to make a negotiation or make a proposal, you're going to want to have lots of facts and figures available to you, maybe charts and graphs so that you can make a presentation uh, for that. You're going to want to know which cultures are going to be more interested or concerned about the bottom line, how much things are going to cost them, how long it's going to take to do it, and which cultures are going to be more concerned, less concerned about that, and yet maybe more concerned about how the public is going to take the decision or how what the community is going to think about what they're doing or how the government's going to think about what they're doing, um, what kind of benefit it is to society, so on and so forth. Okay, so you're going to want to know what kind of information to emphasize in your negotiation. All right, important intercultural negotiating skills. First of all, be prepared. All right, know what you're getting into, know what the expectations are going to be of you. Make sure that you are prepared to meet those expectations, whether it is through your personal appearance, the information you're presenting, uh, the uh, the types of interactions you're going to be having, how to greet, how to say goodbye, whatever. And you need to be prepared with your information before you go there. Don't try to learn it as you go along, or you're going to make a lot of very important mistakes right at the beginning that you may not be able to recover from. Develop a sensitivity to the use of time. Again, be prepared for a slower pace. Most cultures are going to take longer than we do when it comes to decision making, but the flip side to that is that once implementation happens, it's going to go much quicker. Listen carefully, become comfortable with silence. remember that silence is not always a negative thing in every culture. So just because in a negotiation there are points of silence or maybe even long pauses where nobody says anything, this is not necessarily a bad thing. This can be a very good thing in some cultures, and you want to make sure uh, what kind of culture you're in, right? So that if you have a moment of silence, that you're not scrambling to try to fill that silence. If you know that silence is a good thing in that culture, you may want to just kind of let it happen and then even encourage it or even, uh, you know, uh, start it yourself, okay? All right, learn to tolerate ambiguity. When you are dealing with another culture, particularly if there's more than one language at play, there's always going to be times when you don't know what's going on. Deal with it. That is really hard for Americans. It's easy to say, hard to do. We want to know what's going on all the time because we have that concept in our culture. We're masters of our own uh, um, masters of our own fate, right? So in order to be masters of our own fate, we need to be able to know what's happening so that we can make decisions in order to direct our fate. And that's hard when you don't know always what's going on. Um, but that's just the way it's going to be when you're dealing with other cultures and other languages. No matter how much you know about that culture or that language, there are going to be times when you're just simply not the native person and you simply aren't going to understand what's going on. In some cases, other cultures tend to be more ambiguous anyway and in the ways that they communicate, and that's just normal for them. So you want to become comfortable with ambiguity and try to locate areas of agreement rather than areas of conflict. You're not always going to agree, particularly when you have different cultural ideologies kind of butting heads. You're going to have conflict. You're going to have different ways of approaching things. And if you focus on your differences, then you'll never get past them. You need to try to focus and locate and focus on your areas of agreement. It is through the focusing on areas of agreement that you will be able to overcome those areas of disagreement. Speaking of conflict, let's talk a little bit about how to manage conflict. There are some common approaches to managing conflict. We have avoidance, and that's physically or mentally removing yourself from the situation. Sometimes that can be a good tool. If things are getting a little heated, moving yourself away from that situation or maybe even just away from that topic and focusing on something else that you do agree on is a great way to kind of let that one cool off a little bit, and then you can come back to it later with a cooler, more amenable head, and then be able to solve it than if you just stick on the area of disagreement and beat it and beat it and beat it until people are starting to feel really bad about each other and about the whole project. Accommodation, one tries to satisfy or appease the other. Again, that can be a useful tool from time to time, but if done too much, it creates an imbalance in the partnership, and that will ultimately be an ineffective way to have a partnership. Somebody's going to feel underrepresented, somebody's going to feel taken advantage of, and in the long run, that's not going to be good for your partnership. So, while that can be a good tool, you want to make sure that you minimize that. Competition is encouraged in some cultures but discouraged in others. We talked about that when we talked about aggression. So sometimes a great way, if you're with the right culture, to overcome conflict is to say, okay, you give me a proposal and you give me a proposal, and then based on your proposals, we'll choose one or the other. Um, that can be a very effective way in some cultures, but it can also be a very disruptive way in other cultures and would actually backfire on you. So just make sure you know what what kind of culture you're in. And then collaboration, all parties work together to resolve conflict, which of course is the best way to do it. And then they can all skip through the halls and throw flowers. And yeah, so again, wonderful idea. Doesn't always work, but it's certainly something that in all cultures one needs to strive to, or to try and get. All right, first of all, when you do have an intercultural conflict, what do you do? First, first thing you have to do is identify the problem. Isolate what the true issue is and resolve the true issue. So you may have a human resources problem, right? Uh, one person may think that they've been harassed, and another person may not understand why that person feels that way, and there's a big conflict there. Or maybe a manager doesn't understand why a subordinate is not doing what he said, what he's supposed to be, what he's asked to do, right? um, Maybe there's not the maybe the problem isn't because you have an inattentive employee, or maybe the problem isn't because you have somebody is actually harassing somebody else. Um, Maybe the problem is because we don't understand the differences or the rules of interpersonal distance, or we don't understand the rules of touching allowed or disallowed in a particular culture. Or perhaps we don't understand how normal greeting is in a particular culture. I mean, if somebody came up to me in a business or professional setting and kissed me on the cheek in Mexico, I would consider that to be normal in the normal course of business, especially if I'd met them before. But if somebody does that to me in the United States, I'm probably going to be offended and really taken back by that. It's simply not a custom here that is considered to be appropriate, but it is a custom there. So if somebody from there comes here and does that in the United States, they may not understand, the person who's receiving that kiss may not understand that, and claim harassment, and when in reality it's just a cultural misunderstanding. So we need to isolate the true issue. Are we having a real harassment issue, or are we having a cultural misunderstanding? And if it is a cultural misunderstanding, we can resolve that cultural misunderstanding through education, through intercultural education of our employees, by helping them to understand what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate in different cultures, and what is going to be considered appropriate in your particular corporate setting, rather than simply firing somebody because they had an allegation against them, or simply firing an employee because they're not responding to your management techniques. Maybe it's better off to, instead of firing a good employee, teaching a manager how best to interact with that employee, and what that employee may be expecting of that particular manager. All right, do not rush. Slow down and take your time to resolve problems, because not all problems are immediately understandable. Sometimes the true cause of problems takes a little time to root out. So if you're not seeing it right away, don't give up on it. Take your time, try to figure it out. Don't make rash decisions, because cultural nuances are often buried within our interactions and our communications, and we don't necessarily see them right away. It takes a little bit of time to educate ourselves and to understand what's really going on. Keep an open mind, remain open to other positions, to other ways of doing things, other ways of seeing things, other ways of perceiving communications, other ways of communication perception or communicating perceptions. All right. So you realize that your way is not the only way, and not even the only effective way. But there are going to be a lot of different effective ways to do things, and sometimes you're going to have to alter your way of doing things in order to accommodate another way. Focus on ideas and not people. Remember to save face for other people. Many other cultures beyond our own are collective face saving cultures. If we are dealing with somebody who is from a collective face saving culture, we have to be very careful to try and work within that collective face saving mindset. And that can even be very effective within our own individualistic culture as well. Trying not to Trying to resolve a problem without making someone look bad can actually be a way um, of making sure that that conflict doesn't come back in the future. It can be a much better way of resolving an issue than simply telling somebody you're wrong, do it this way, or else kind of attitude. You want to, when there is a problem, focus on the problem, not on the people who are uh, are doing the problem. Okay, so maybe in a department we have one or two people who are doing something wrong. Well, instead of focusing on those one or two people, maybe we have a whole training for the entire department, right? Where we remind people, hey, this is the way we need to be done. Some of us do this, or maybe some of us have an issue with this. Send out an email to the whole group rather than pinpointing one or two individuals saying that, you're wrong, and you're wrong, and everybody else is right, but you two are wrong. No, just send out an email to the whole group saying, we have an issue. Some people are doing this incorrectly. Let's do this correctly, and that's it. We don't necessarily need to point fingers. Develop techniques for conflict avoidance, such as using the habits of group pronouns. Again, we have a problem. We need to discuss something. We uh, we did really well. Okay, so it doesn't always have to be a problem, right? Uh, Use group pronouns rather than focusing on the individual. When focusing on the group, you're giving out the information that you need, but you're also saving face of the particular individual who may be doing it incorrectly. Make sure to fully understand the communication or situation before you react to it, especially in an intercultural type of situation. Uh, your first perception of a behavior or a communication is not always the correct perception. You need to take that perception and put it on ice until you've understood the background of the behavior or of the communication, to understand where it's coming from, what it means, maybe how the person who used that particular behavior or communication perceived the situation, and that's why they used that, or what maybe they mean by that, which may be different from what you perceived. Make sure that you take the time to understand the whole situation before reacting to it. Otherwise, your reactions are often going to be the incorrect ones, and that's going to create more conflict instead of resolve conflict. All right, so in conclusion, this just kind of gives you a nutshell idea of some of the issues that we need to keep in mind and talk, and that we need to research and know about before going to do business or any kind of professional interaction with another culture. These are the types of things that I'm going to need you to be talking about when you do your presentation. These are the types of things that you're going to need to include in your group projects. So, really look to this cult or to this chapter for some guidance when you are choosing your content for this particular project. And it's not just for this project either. Most of you, I know, in this online version, many of you are full-time workers or part-time workers. You're already out there in the workforce. I'm sure you've seen this already. I'm sure that you can take this information right now and say, yes, I've seen that happen in the workplace. You need to know this stuff, and maybe you'll see the next conflict between people of different cultures in a different way. You'll be able to approach that in a more effective way from here forward. Take this information and apply it in your daily lives. Look for things when you go out to work tomorrow. See what happens. See what you might see differently, what you might perceive differently when you look at it from the standpoint of a multicultural individual. All right, so that's it for this section, and next week we're going to be talking about education and healthcare.